Mom had this way of introducing me at family gatherings that told you everything you needed to know about where I stood. "And this is Ellie," she'd say with a little pause before my name. The kind of pause that precedes something you've already forgotten. "Not our Ellie, not my daughter Ellie, just this is Ellie," like she was pointing out a lamp she'd had for years but never really liked. My brother got our Ryan, always possessive, always proud. Ryan, who sold cars at a dealership in Naperville and somehow made that sound like he was running Goldman Sachs. I'm a court reporter. I sat in federal courtrooms for 7 years, typing faster than most people think, transcribing words that decide people's lives. Nobody at Thanksgiving ever asked me about that. They asked Ryan whether the dealership was expanding. I'm 29. I share an apartment in the city with a cat named Biscuit and a collection of half-read novels on my nightstand. I'm not unhappy. I want to make that clear before I tell you the rest of this, because the rest of this is going to sound like I was. But I wasn't. I built something quiet and real and mine, and I had learned, mostly, to stop waiting for my family to notice. Mostly. The phone call came on a Tuesday night at 11:40. I was already in bed, half asleep, when my brother's name lit up my screen. Ryan never called me. We texted maybe twice a month. Obligatory stuff. Birthday wishes, links to memes he thought I'd like that I never did. I answered because something in my gut said to, "Hey." His voice was tight. "Performing casual. So I need to ask you something, and I need you to just hear me out before you say anything." I sat up. "Okay. You know Priya?" I did. Priya had been his girlfriend for almost 2 years. She was an environmental lawyer, beautiful and sharp in the way that made you feel like she was always 3 steps ahead of whatever conversation you were having. I liked her a lot, actually. I'd always thought she was too good for my brother, but I kept that to myself. "She said yes," Ryan said. "Last weekend, we're engaged. Ryan, that's Mom and Dad, are doing a dinner with Priya's family this Saturday. Her parents, her aunt and uncle, her grandmother." He stopped. "Her dad is Judge Srinivasan." The name landed like a stone in still water. Judge Anand Srinivasan. I knew that name the way I knew the names of maybe 15 people on this earth, from sitting 10 feet away from him for weeks at a time, my fingers moving across my keyboard, every word he spoke passing through me before it entered the official record. He presided over 2 trials I covered in the past 3 years, a civil rights case, a federal fraud case that ran 11 weeks and made the front page of the Tribune. He was serious and fair, and occasionally quietly funny in the way that very intelligent people sometimes are. He remembered people's names. He brought his own coffee in a thermos that had "World's Okayest Judge" written on it, which I had always found privately delightful. "I know who he is," I said. "Right." Ryan exhaled. "So here's the thing. Mom's nervous. You know how she gets. She wants Saturday to go smoothly, and she asked me to talk to you." "Talk to me about what?" Silence. "Ryan," she said. And these are her words, not mine. She said maybe you could just kind of hang back a little. Let me and Priya do most of the talking. Don't bring up work stuff, don't make it weird, just be there, be normal, don't embarrass you. He didn't answer. She said, "Don't embarrass you. That's what this call is. She's just stressed, Ellie. You know how she—" "Yeah," I said. "I know how she is." I hung up. How she is. I hung up, she is. I hung up, she is. I lay back down in the dark and stared at the ceiling for a long time. Biscuit walked across my chest and settled on my sternum like a small, warm anchor. I thought about not going. I built the whole argument in my head. "I have plans. I'm busy. Send my congratulations." It was a good argument. It was the correct argument. But then I thought about Priya, who had said yes to my brother, who deserved to have his whole family at the table when she brought hers, even the parts of his family he was apparently embarrassed by. I texted my mom, "I'll be there at 6. She replied with a thumbs up emoji. Not thank you. Not can't wait to see you. A thumbs up. I want to tell you something about my mother, because I don't want her to be a villain in this story. She's not a villain. She's a woman who grew up in a small town in Ohio, believing that the way you look to other people was the most important thing about you, and nobody ever taught her any different. And she passed that down to us the way people pass down recipes, without thinking about whether it was still good, whether it still served anyone, whether maybe it was time to try something new. She loved Ryan because Ryan was easy to love in the way she understood. He was charming and social, and he brought home girlfriends who looked like they belonged in catalogs. He fit the frame she built in her head for successful son. I didn't fit any frame she built. I was quiet. I read too much. I chose a career she couldn't explain to her friends without a pause. She does court reporting. It's like, she types in court. And I had never brought home anyone she could put in a frame. She didn't dislike me. I want to be precise about this. She just didn't know what to do with me. And when people don't know what to do with something, they often push it to the edge of the frame, out of the way somewhere it won't interfere with the composition. I'd spent most of my adult life being edged out of the composition. Saturday came the way difficult things always do, faster than you want and slower than you can stand. I wore a navy dress I'd bought for a colleague's retirement party 2 years ago. I did my hair. I thought, exactly like someone who was told to hang back and not embarrass anyone. My parents' house in Elmhurst smelled like the roast chicken my mom only made when she was trying to impress people. The good dishes were out, the ones that lived in the cabinet above the refrigerator and came down twice a year, fresh flowers on the table, which I could count on one hand, the number of times I'd seen in 30 years. Ryan was in the living room with Priya, both of them already in the performance of being engaged, touching each other's arms, laughing a little too easily. My dad was opening a bottle of wine in the kitchen and gave me a hug that meant glad you came, and also, please don't make anything complicated, which was the kind of hug I had come to accept from him. He was a gentle man who had learned, somewhere along the way, that keeping the peace was more important than keeping score. I understood it. I had never fully forgiven him for it. My mom came out of the kitchen and her eyes swept me top to bottom in the way that was so practiced, I don't think she even knew she did it anymore. Looking for anything that needed correcting before the guests arrived. "You look nice," she said, which in her language meant acceptable. "Thank you," I said, which in mine meant I heard you. Priya's family arrived at 6:15, her parents first, then her aunt and uncle, then her grandmother, who was 83 and moved with the particular certainty of someone who had outlasted every difficult thing the world had thrown at her, and had no intention of being impressed by anything so minor as a dinner party. And then Judge Srinivasan walked into my parents' living room, and I had the very specific experience of watching two separate versions of my life collide in a way I had no framework for. He was wearing a gray blazer and the same kind of careful presence he carried in his courtroom. Not stiff, but intentional. Like someone who had learned exactly how much space he took up in a room and was thoughtful about it. My mom was already orbiting him, laughing too loudly at something he said, touching my dad's arm to pull him into the conversation, radiating the specific energy of someone who needed this to go well more than they needed anything else. I stood near the fireplace and watched. Priya brought her father around to meet everyone, and I watched my mom introduce Ryan with the warmth she reserved for accomplishments. Our Ryan, Priya's fiancé, he manages a very successful. Then Priya reached me. "Dad," she said, "this is Ellie, Ryan's sister." Judge Srinivasan turned, and I saw it, the exact moment of recognition. Not slow, not uncertain. The immediate, clear recognition of someone who has looked at your face across a room for weeks and knows exactly where you fit. "Ellie," he said, and his voice had the same quality it had in the courtroom, measured, not unkind. "You're the court reporter." The room shifted, not dramatically, not like in a movie. But I felt it, my mother's attention snapped toward me like a compass finding north. "I am," I said. "It's good to meet you properly, Your Honor. And please." He shook my head. "The Caldwell trial last spring. You were there for all 11 weeks. Every day. That's not easy work." "That case was," he paused, choosing his words. "A lot to carry." It had been. The Caldwell trial was a fraud case that had destroyed a pension fund and left several hundred retirees with nothing. I had typed every word of it, including the victim impact statements, which I had never entirely gotten out of my head. I told him that. I didn't plan to. It just came out the way things do when someone asks you a real question instead of a polite one. He nodded slowly. I think about those statements too. We talked for maybe 10 minutes there by the fireplace. He asked about the mechanics of court reporting, how fast, how accurate, what happened when something went wrong. He asked whether I'd covered anything recently that had stayed with me. He was the kind of person who asked questions and then actually waited for the answer, which is rarer than it should be. At some point, I became aware that the room had rearranged itself. Priya was watching us with an expression I couldn't entirely read, something between surprised and pleased. My dad had drifted over and was listening. My mom was standing near the kitchen doorway, very still, and Ryan was watching me with an expression I had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not jealousy. Something more complicated than that. The look of someone who's just understood something they probably should have understood a long time ago. Dinner was good. The chicken was good. The wine was good. Priya's grandmother told a story about arriving in Chicago in 1978 with $40 and a cousin's address written on a piece of paper. And everyone at the table went quiet in the particular way people go quiet when they're listening to something real. I sat at the far end of the table, where I'd been placed, and I didn't hang back. I don't mean I made a scene or took over. I mean, I answered when I was spoken to, and I spoke when I had something to say, which it turned out was fairly often, because Priya's family were the kind of people who thought conversation was something you built together, rather than something you performed at each other. Her aunt asked me how long I'd been in court reporting. Her uncle, who was a public defender in Cook County, wanted to know about the process of ordering transcripts for appeals. Judge Srinivas asked my opinion on something, I don't even remember what, and I gave it, and he pushed back thoughtfully, and I pushed back on his pushback, and it was the best conversation I'd had at a dinner table in years. At some point, my mom got up to refill the bread basket, and I followed her into the kitchen. She was standing at the counter with her back to me. She didn't turn around when I came in. Mom, the rolls need another minute, she said. Okay. Silence. The oven ticked. You could have told me, she said finally, quietly, that you knew him. I thought about that for a moment. You could have asked. She turned around. Her face was doing something I didn't have a word for, something between embarrassed and grief-stricken, and something else, something smaller and older that I thought might be shame. I didn't know, she said. I know you didn't. I mean, she stopped. Started again. I didn't know that you had. She gestured vaguely in the direction of the dining room, the direction of the conversation, the direction of the version of me that had just existed out there in front of people she wanted to impress. I didn't know. I looked at her for a long moment. You never asked, I said. Not angry, just true. In 7 years, you never once asked me about a single case. You never asked what it was like to sit in those rooms. You never asked about any of it. She opened her mouth and closed it. I'm not saying that to hurt you, I said. I'm saying it because I think you should know it. I think you should know that there was a lot to ask. The oven timer went off. She turned back to it and took out the rolls and stood there with her back to me for a moment. And her shoulders did something. A small, involuntary thing, like a wall deciding it was tired of holding itself up. I'm sorry, she said. It was quiet. It was the quietest I had ever heard her. I didn't say it's fine because it wasn't. I didn't say I forgive you because I wasn't there yet. I said, thank you. Because she meant it, I thought. And because meaning it was a beginning, even if it was a very small one. We brought the rolls back to the table. Ryan texted me that night after everyone had gone home. I didn't know either, he wrote. I stared at the text for a while. I thought about all the things it meant, and all the things it didn't mean, and all the years of being introduced as this is Ellie, with the pause before my name. I know, I wrote back. He sent back a thumbs up, which might have been thoughtless or might have been everything he had. With Ryan, I had never entirely been able to tell the difference. Priya texted me separately later when I was already home with Biscuit on my lap. For what it's worth, my dad does not impress easily. He talked about you the whole drive home. I'm really glad Ryan has you for a sister. I read that 3 times. I want to tell you that I had some kind of revelation that night, some clean, cinematic moment of healing. I didn't. What I had was a quieter thing. The sense that something which had been pressed flat for a long time had been given, suddenly, a little more room. My mother called me the following week. We talked for 40 minutes, which was longer than we talked on the phone in years. She asked me about my job. She asked real questions, what it felt like to sit in on cases that affected real people, how I managed the difficult parts, whether I found it meaningful. I told her yes. I told her about the Caldwell trial, about the victim impact statements, about the retired teacher who had stood at the podium and talked about the vacation she was supposed to take with her husband before he died. The one she'd saved for 30 years and would now never take. My mom was quiet for a long time after that. Then she said, I think you do something really important. She's not fixed. I want to be honest about that because the version of the story where she becomes a different person overnight is not the real version. She is who she is, shaped by things that happened long before me. And change at her age is a slow, effortful thing that has to be chosen every day. But she's trying. I can see the trying, and I have decided that seeing the trying is enough. For now, to keep the door open. It's my door. I get to decide that. I think that's the part that took me the longest to understand. That the door belonged to me. Not to her, not to Ryan, not to anyone who had ever decided where to seat me at the table, or how to introduce me to people they were trying to impress. Mine. I had a coffee with Priya last month, just the two of us, at a place near her office in the Loop. She told me her father had apparently mentioned me to two of his colleagues, which I found so surprising I laughed out loud. We talked for 2 hours and neither of us looked at our phones. She is going to be a wonderful addition to this family. I hope for her sake we're worth it. I think we might be getting there. I thought a lot about that Tuesday night, lying in the dark after I hung up on my brother, Biscuit sitting on my chest like he knew I needed the weight of something real. The thing about being the one your family doesn't know how to talk about is that you start to wonder, after a while, whether you've been wrong about yourself. Whether the silence means something true. You carry that doubt quietly, the way you carry anything you're not sure you're allowed to put down. I wasn't wrong, I just hadn't been seen yet. And that's the part I keep coming back to, not the dinner. Not the moment Judge Srinivasan said my name across a room full of people who had spent years not saying it with any particular warmth. What I keep coming back to is the 7 years before that. 7 years of showing up to work and doing something genuinely hard and meaningful, without anyone in my family ever asking what it felt like. 7 years of the Caldwell trial, and the civil rights cases and the victim impact statements I carried home in my chest without anywhere to put them. Nobody took that from me. That was mine regardless. That's the thing nobody tells you when you're the one edged out of the frame. The work doesn't stop mattering just because the people closest to you aren't watching. The retired teacher at that podium, the one who lost her vacation fund and her husband and 30 years of careful saving, I was there. I took down every word. That happened whether or not my mom could explain my job to her friends at the garden club. What I've learned, not from that dinner, but from the slow accumulation of years, is that integrity isn't something you perform for an audience. You either build it or you don't, and you build it in the daily, unglamorous work of showing up and doing the thing you said you'd do, even when no one's keeping score. My mother didn't see it because she wasn't looking. But it was there. It had always been there. The harder lesson, the one I'm still learning, is what to do with the people who weren't looking. It would be easier sometimes to close the door. I've imagined it. The clean, quiet relief of just letting them stay on the other side of it. And I won't pretend I haven't had moments where I wanted exactly that. But my mother stood in her kitchen that Saturday night and said I'm sorry in the quietest voice I have ever heard from her. And I believe she meant it. Not because she's changed. She hasn't. Not completely. Not yet. But because meaning it is where change has to start, and I think it takes more courage than people give it credit for. To stand in your own kitchen at 63 and admit you've been looking at your daughter wrong for most of her life. I kept a door open. That was my choice. Not for her, for me. Because I have watched what happens to people who carry closed doors inside them for too long, and it is not a life I want. Ryan sent me a thumbs up. Priya sent me a paragraph. I think I know which sibling I'm going to be closer to. What I want to say to anyone who's spent years being introduced with a pause before their name is this: keep building the thing anyway. Not to prove anything to the people who weren't watching. For yourself. Because the work is real whether or not it's witnessed, and one day, maybe at a dinner table you expected nothing from, someone is going to walk into the room who knows exactly what you've been doing all along. That's not luck. That's what happens when you don't stop.